Hey guys, so today we're going to look at capital and interest rates as a factor of production. So capital is anything that is man-made and it's used to produce goods and services and create wealth. So an example that we ran through in class would be machinery, vehicles or money invested. So first of all you have types of capitals. First you have fixed capital, which is stocks of fixed assets such as buildings, equipment and machinery which are valuable to a company. Then you have social capital, so they're assets or wealth that's owned by a community or society, such as roads, schools and hospitals. Private capital is owned by individuals and companies. And then finally, just two little definitions here in terms of capital stock. That's the value of capital goods in existence at any given period. So every company would know what their capital stock is. And also every company that has capital stock would have depreciation on that stock. And that's the loss in value of any capital goods during a given period. Now, the one asset that we tend not to have depreciation on, that would be anything to do with land. So, for example, buildings. The buildings themselves may depreciate or may deteriorate, but if the price of the land, which often is the case, appreciates, then we don't see any depreciation there. So now we're just going to look at some features of capital. So capital makes land more or labour more productive. So the more capital at the disposal of the worker, the greater his or her output will be. So if you can imagine a farmer who's working a handheld plough with a horse or a donkey compared to a farmer who has a tractor, there's obviously going to be a big difference there. The creation of capital involves an opportunity cost, so the more resources devoted to the production of capital goods, fewer resources can be devoted to consumer goods. So for example, if we take the example of our tractor here, when we look at consumer goods, our consumer goods might be cars. So the company that makes this style of tractor, which is called John Deere, they've decided to devote all their resources to making capital goods, machinery, as opposed to making consumer durables, consumer goods such as cars. And one final point, and I think this one is kind of obvious, a reduction in current consumption must take place if future consumption is to be higher. So that idea, and you all have come across this before, where you want to buy something that is of high value. So let's say something like an iPhone or AirPods, and you must reduce your consumption. So that might mean not going to Pennies or not going to the shopping centre or to the shops at the weekend or getting your favourite takeaway, because you know that your future consumption is going to be higher. You're going to have this new iPhone or AirPods and this is something that you want. That might also be the case if you're saving for your holidays, or if you're going to be going on holidays, you might try and spend a little less now because your consumption during holidays is going to be much higher. And then finally, savers provide funds for those wishing to invest. So saving is the part of income that's not spent. So income, we either consume it or we save it, okay? So we either spend it or save. Saving is usually undertaken by people whose income exceeds their current needs and people who decide to forego present consumption in favour of future consumption. In either case, the saver is entitled to a return for making funds available to those who wish to invest, and this is called the rate of interest. So the saver can put their money into a financial institution, they can receive interest on that money, and the money that they receive at a later date will be higher, and that will depend on the interest rate itself. So we know that the borrowers will pay a higher rate of return. So what happens is, if I want to borrow €5,000, I'm going to pay back more than €5,000. That will depend on the rate of interest, and financial institutions, what they'll do is they'll set a higher rate of interest for borrowing than they will for saving, so that when they use somebody else's money to give to me, then the rate of interest that I pay, they'll only pass a small percentage of that over to the saver, and then they keep the rest as profits. So just a nice little picture here on how interest is the return for capital. So if the owner of a business wants to buy a machine that costs €500,000, they may have to go to the bank for a loan. The bank gets the €500,000 for this loan from its savers. Well, a machine might be a little bit crazy here, maybe something like a building. So the bank gets the €500,000 for this loan from its savers. Savers need to be rewarded for saving and not spending, and the reward for not spending is the rate of interest received. So what they do is they borrow they take the money from the savers, they give this person their 500,000, then So these savers may have put their money in for a term. So that's maybe a deposit account whereby they are not allowed to withdraw for 5 years, or they have to give 30 days notice if they want to withdraw. And that just gives the bank a little bit of time to take the money or get the money together and pay them back. And what happens is they will get more, as I said in the last slide, they'll get more of an interest rate off this woman here who's borrowing the 500,000, and they'll only give a small percentage of that to savers themselves. Okay, so let's look at why people save. So first of all, people save because they want to purchase some expensive item in the future, and we've talked about that, how sometimes people will forgo their current consumption in order, because they know their future consumption is going to be higher. We talked about this in class, so it's to get a good credit rating so that's easier to get a loan in the future. For thrift purposes, so to restrict their spending in line with a prudent budget and avoid wasteful impulse buying, and we see that a lot more of people wanting to be sustainable and not buy things that they're going to throw away very quickly. They want to buy durable goods. Speculation, so for an investment opportunity, example being the purchase of shares in anticipation of the price rising, hence profit. And we can also put in a really good example there, might be house prices. So if they think that house prices are going to get higher and higher in the future, or if they think that they're going to fall, they may not spend right now, and they might just save their money in the hope that they'll be able to afford it in the near future. To earn interest, so financial institutions offer interest on money saved, which is an incentive for people to accumulate wealth. And then finally, to provide for a retirement. So weekly income will decrease when you retire. To prevent any drastic fall in the standard of living, some people will save using a private pension scheme. And what about the factors that affect the level of savings? So some of these are going to be very, very obvious. The first one being the level of income. So obviously if somebody is on a higher level of income, they're able to save more of their income than somebody who's just meeting their needs. So those who are meeting just their needs may not be able to save much of their income. The rate of interest is a big one. So the rate of interest is the reward given to the saver. And obviously the higher the rate of interest, the more the incentive there is to save. And the opposite is true of that. If there's a lower interest rate, then what's going to happen is you are going to find people save less and they may decide to borrow more. And that's because the cost of borrowing will be low. So if they've decided that they want to buy a high value product and borrow money to buy that product over 5 years, then it's much cheaper when the interest rate is much lower. So sometimes we talked about this before with monetary policy. Sometimes this is used to try and control the economy. So if there's a higher rate of interest, they may be trying to get people to save because inflation has gotten so high, or they want to kind of slow down the economy, so people are spending so much money, and the rate of interest, they might increase the rate of interest in line with financial institutions. They might increase the rate of interest. As well as that, if the interest rate is low, sometimes that's because the economy is not doing so well, and the government, in line with the EU, in which because we know that the EU control our interest rates, and in line with financial institutions, they may lower the interest rate, and then that is to encourage people to save less, and you'll see more people borrowing because the cost of borrowing is much lower. The level of state benefits and pensions. So if old age pensions provided by the state are very generous, then there's less incentive for people to save money for retirement and vice versa. But that's a dangerous assumption to make. And the reason we say that that's a dangerous assumption to make is that at any time, the state pensions could be cut, or state benefits could be cut. So for example, if I'm thinking about pension for, somebody, let's say somebody starting out when they are in their, let's say, mid-20s, and they're starting their job and they're not thinking about pensions, and they go and they keep spending, maybe they get to 50 or 55, they're spending a lot of money and they're not worried about retirement. But if our economy is not doing well, or if there's a massive shock in our economy, just before that person retires, there could be a huge cut in state pension, or any state benefits for that matter as well. And then what happens is these people have not planned they haven't thought about that possibility, and they've not allowed for it. So it's important not to make that assumption, because as you know, governments come and go, they change, and different policies change as well. So it's important. That's why they often encourage people in their 20s to start as a private pension, just to make sure that they'll have enough money for when they retire. A couple of other things now, and I'm not going to go into great detail here. The level of tax on interest on savings. So DIRT is the deposit interest retention tax, and if that tax is quite high, then it'll discourage saving, because then you have to pay some of that interest that you earn over to the government. So that can't be too high in order to encourage saving. And then finally, the rate of inflation. So the rate of inflation may result in negative interest rates. That is, if your rate of inflation, if that increases in the period of time that you've been saving your money, and your money loses its purchasing power. So for example, you save, let's say you're going to buy a car, you put in some money into a deposit account to leave it there for 5 years. You get your money back with interest, but now the value of the car has increased because of inflation, and even though you maybe at the very beginning had enough money, you knew after 5 years you're going to have enough money to buy that car. You now don't have enough money because inflation has caused that the price of that car to increase. And the final one being consumer expectations. And I just popped this in here because we always talk about behaviour and how behaviour affects the economy. So if the consumers think that the future of the economy, and this happened a couple of years back, I said to you, with Italy. Example, Italy. So Italy ran a budget deficit, and the idea was they increased their government expenditure, and part of that was their social welfare, and they thought that if they gave their people more money, then what would happen, and they obviously increase tax credits and reduce tax, and they hoped that if they gave their people in their economy more money, that they'd spend more. But what happened is that the Italian people thought to themselves, well, we're going to end up having to pay this back at a later date. And what they did was they actually saved the extra money that they got, which meant that the intention of giving them more money was that they would spend and it would stimulate the economy. But the opposite actually happened. What they did was they pushed them into further deficit, because people just saved that money in the anticipation that they'd have to pay higher taxes at a later date. And this can happen as well, and we see it with COVID, where our government decreased the VAT to 21% from 23%. And I'm not really sure how that worked out in terms of stimulating our economy, but people may worry about the safety of their jobs, and that's something that's happening at the minute with COVID, and people are increasing their savings as a result. So people can have continued to buy their fixed amount of goods now at a cheaper price, and the savings that they made because of the reduction in VAT, they may have actually saved that rather than spend more.